Well, good evening, everyone, to people who are in the East and the Midwest. And it's actually evening here, too, just very early evening here in Oakland, California. I'm the Reverend Rosemary Bray McNatt, and it is my honor to serve as president of Starr King School for the Ministry in Oakland, California. This is the first of a series of four lectures on psychedelics and the sacred. And we are delighted to host this very important series coming at a very important time in the history of plant based medicine, which is really what psychedelics is about. For many years, in fits and starts at first, and then more consistently, Starr King has had an opportunity or given people an opportunity to examine seriously the relationship between what folks commonly refer to as psychedelic substances and their connection to the divine. It has happened as early as the 1970s, but Starr King really began to pay attention to this more seriously in the 2000s. Our late provost, Ibrahim Farajage, introduced classes of that kind, and it has become clear to us in the succeeding years how important it would be for Starr King, with our history of counter oppressive um, and multi religious commitments, to talk about plant based medicine in a way that honors the indigenous peoples and cultures that have used this medicine over time, and not to have it be sensationalized as though it were a bunch of people dropping acid in a hot tub, which is some of what the image remains to this day. It's only been in the last 10 years, perhaps, that people have really begun to drill down, both in the academic world and in the world of the religious slash spiritual, to try to understand more clearly what the benefits of plant based medicine are. And we thought it would be a great idea to combine those two seemingly separate areas in a way that would be unique to Starr King. In doing that, we are blessed to have with us Ayize Jama-Everett, a 2001 Starr King graduate, and a person with a lot of experience in examining psychedelics and plant based medicine. He is also a therapist, he is also an award winning writer. We are grateful to have him in our orbit. And I want to turn this over to Ayize now to introduce our first guest in the series. Ayize?
Thank you so much, Rosemary. Um, Absolute pleasure and honor to be introduced by Rosemary and to start this lecture series on the sacred and the psychedelic, or psychedelics and the seminary. I have been teaching a class at Starr King School for the Ministry since about 2005, off and on, called The Sacred and the Substance, that looks at the history of plant-based medicine and people throughout the world. Um, it's been an absolute pleasure to teach it. I really feel like I've helped to inform, at least in the Bay Area, some of the practices that go on. And one of the great things about the class is that we always have amazing speakers. And that's something that students have commented on again and again and again, that we really have some great people come in and sort of share their wisdom with us. So you can imagine how excited I was when I randomly reached out to someone who has written what I'm seriously considering one of the seminal books of the decade around psychedelics and religion. Um, that, like, when I reached out to him, that he was willing to come and speak to all of us about his work and about the larger implications of his text for the modern psychedelic renaissance. I'm speaking, of course, Brian Muraresku, absolutely amazing guy. I consider him a friend, even though we've yet to meet in person. Damn COVID. He graduated Phi Beta Kappa from Brown University with a degree in Latin, Greek, and Sanskrit, sorry. As an alumni of Georgetown Law and member of the Bar of New York and D.C., he's been practicing law internationally for 15 years. In 2016, with the NFL, 2018, with the NFL, Muraresku represented the first professional athlete in the United States to seek a therapeutic use exemption for cannabis. Of course, in 2020, his debut book, The Immortality Key, became a New York Times bestseller. Audible named it the best of 2020 in the history category. Following the launch, Muraresku appeared on CNN, NPR, and has been featured in Forbes, The Daily Beast, Big Think, Vox, Vice Magazine, LA Review of Books, as well as the Jordan Peterson and Lex Fridman podcast. Says he lives in outside of Washington with his wife and 2 daughters. I have a suspicion he might be in Uruguay right now. Brian, absolute pleasure to have you. Thanks for being with us.
It's an honor. Ayize, thank you. And believe it or not, I'm calling an audible today. I'm in Mexico.
What? Of course, I knew it.
Good to see you.
It's so good to see you, Brian. I want to talk about so many things, and if it was just me and you, we would just sit down and just chat for days on end. But I know I have a bunch of students that are really excited to ask you some questions. And I also know that there are some folks out there who haven't read the book, but are maybe just curious about the topic. So I'm wondering if you can maybe start us out, if you'd be willing to read 2 questions that you pose on page 14 and 15 of your book, if that's okay.
Sure, I can read them verbatim if you like.
Please.
Okay, so and basically my book is divided into 2 relatively equal halves. And in the first half, I'm really studying the notion of psychedelics in the ancient Greco-Roman world. And in the second half, maybe more controversially, in the rise of Christianity. And so what was guiding my investigation over the past 2 years were 2 seminal questions that were posed well before me by scholars going back at least into the 1960s, if not before. So question number 1, before the rise of Christianity, did the ancient Greeks consume a secret psychedelic sacrament during their most famous and well-attended religious rituals? That's number 1. And number 2, did the ancient Greeks pass a version of their sacrament along to the earliest Greek-speaking Christians for whom the original Holy Communion or Eucharist was in fact a psychedelic Eucharist?
Big questions. I guess my first question is, you who are not a psychedelic enthusiast, you who profess to have never done, and I believe you, profess to have never experienced any psychedelics, why was this a motivation for you? Why did you want to write this text?
Yeah, so I remain a psychedelic virgin, so I can't claim any firsthand knowledge of these holy substances, but hypotheses around their use, like I said, have been around for decades. My favorite quote is that Houston Smith, who the audience might know, one of the more influential religious scholars of the 20th century, he participated in the Harvard psilocybin project, through the Good Friday experiment. This is
Right.
actually 60 years ago this year, this Good Friday. And when it came to psychedelics and religion, he had a lot of interesting ideas, and he wound up describing the potential use of psychedelics among the ancient Greeks as the best kept secret in history. And that's a phrase that had run across my radar for a while, and it's kind of hard to put down the quest for something so elusive. My own background in classics, like you said, in Latin and Greek, really kind of just drove this as a passion project for many, many years. That's all it was. I was intrigued by the idea. I thought it was an interesting, historical mystery, but then the present day implications became clear to me when I started reading about the clinical trials coming out of Johns Hopkins, which are now 20 years old themselves. And in about 2006, 2007, I started reading about these mystical experiences that the clinical volunteers were having. And from a single intervention of something like psilocybin, I was hearing testimony that reminded me about some of the testimony that survived in the ancient world, in places like Eleusis or the Dionysian mysteries. This concept of having an ego dissolving, psycho-spiritual breakthrough from a single intervention of a solitary psychedelic substance. And it raises obvious questions. If people can have that powerful of an experience today in a very controlled setting, how long has this been happening? Is it 2,000 years old? Is it 20,000 years old? Is it 200,000 years old or more? So, I focus on the classical world and early Christianity because it's what gives rise to us. It's what gives rise to this conversation, and the potential use of these substances around the world and throughout history. But in that Eurasian vehicle and those mystery schools that would give rise to the Roman Catholic Church and these big longstanding institutions.
Yeah. I think one of the questions you ask early on in the text is, there's a fundamental question of are we oriented more towards the Christian? Are we oriented more towards the Roman, right? The Greek, right? And is there just an essential merge that's gone on in Western culture that we can't really parse out? It's such a great way of thinking about it. And I think it leads us to this question about Christianity. And I want to spend a little bit of time talking about Christianity, knowing full well that not everybody who is paying attention to this podcast, this transmission, is Christian. But I think that the Christian influence in the Western world can't be denied. But you read at one point, you say Jesus was born into the wine country of Galilee during the wine millennium, and no less influenced by historical accident that made the wine the premier beverage of the day. The first Christians of Anatolia, Greece, and Italy had already ditched their grain for the wine of that time. Just like prehistoric beer had managed to unearth so far, just like the prehistoric beer we've managed to unearth so far, wine was a very different animal. And I'm just wondering if you can break some of this down for us. So you say, why was it the wine millennium? And what was this historical accident?
Right. So if the book is asking two questions, and the first question is about the ancient Greeks, basically the pre-Christian era, and the second question is about Christianity, the book is also about the two main characters of the book are beer and wine. And beer is this fabulously ancient beverage. It could go back 12,000 years, which is kind of where my book begins, at the beginning of the so-called agricultural revolution, sometimes referred to as the beer revolution, if that's indeed the case. There's this open question and debate in the anthropological, archaeological communities as to why we started cultivating the grain. Did we cultivate the grain to bake it into our first bread, or did we cultivate that barley and wheat in order to grind it and brew it into our first beer? So it's the whole beer versus bread debate that, like I said, goes back about 12,000 years. And beer survived, whichever came first, the bread or the beer stayed, including into the ancient Greek world. So the sacrament, the potion, the holy substance that was used at places like Eleusis, this spiritual capital in ancient Greece that survives for like 2,000 years, right? From about 1500 BC to the 4th century AD. It's thought they were using something like a primitive beer. It was called the koukion in ancient Greek. We don't know the exact ingredients, but in one of the surviving hymns from the 8th century, 7th century BC, the hymn to Demeter, it talks about barley and water and mint. So something like a minty beer, right? Or a porridge of some sort. In any event, we often think about the ancient Greeks as this wine-loving culture, and much of the Mediterranean for that matter. But beer survives. Beer survives, 12,000 years into the rise of Christianity. And yet, when Jesus comes along, that part of the Eastern Mediterranean is beginning to ditch their beer. And so you would find beer further west, like in Iberia. And I won't get into the details about ancient Iberia and Gaul and what today we call France. But, the beer became the drink of barbarians, basically. And wine, first exported from the Near East by Canaanites, Phoenicians, was making its way into Egypt, North Africa, making its way over to the Greek islands, across the Aegean and different parts of the Mediterranean. And so it is kind of a historical accident. Like if Jesus had been born 1,000 years earlier, 2,000 years earlier, we very well might be drinking some kind of beer sacrament at Sunday Mass. But just because of the time he was born in, wine, through the Dionysian mysteries that precede Christianity and through the symposia and all we know about the Greek world, wine was becoming the drink of choice. It was becoming the sacramental drink of choice, and also the recreational drink of choice. And so for that reason, Christ and the earliest Christians very much dip into this notion of wine as a vehicle for communing with the divine, which is not to say you couldn't do it with beer, but it was becoming more fashionable then to use wine in the ancient Near East to invoke the gods, in fact, to become God.
Right. I'm glad you said that. Leads me to my next question. I mean, I think of you as a practicing Catholic to this day, and I see this work. I think you said it at one point as like in part religious quest for you. And I guess I wonder how the notion of apotheosis sits with you now, like the notion of becoming God and that experience through the ingestion of mind-altering substances. I think for a lot of people that might be offensive. And I guess I'm wondering, like, given your research as a practicing Catholic, how do you sit with it now?
Well, I mean, the idea of consuming God to become God is like, I mean, that's like a mandate of the New Testament. I spent a whole chapter looking at the Greek of the Gospel of John in particular, which is fascinating Greek. We all know it as the non-canonical the non-canonical fourth gospel, and I rely a lot on the scholarship of a guy called Dennis MacDonald, who wrote a wonderful book called The Dionysian Gospel. The Greek of John is very, very strange, and the way that John's Greek describes the Eucharist is quite graphic. And so I won't go into great detail, but in the sixth chapter of John,
we talked about.
I mean, yeah, no, exactly. The Greek is very weird. The Greek is very weird. So John is the only evangelist who uses the word trogon when he talks about eating the flesh. And that verb in Greek, trogon, doesn't mean to eat the flesh of God. It means to munch on the flesh or to gnaw at the flesh of God, the way you would like gnaw raw meat off the bone. And that kind of graphic, visceral language is very evocative. It's very reminiscent of the kind of language that was used in the Dionysian mysteries that precede Jesus and the earliest Christians by centuries and centuries. And there it was not uncommon, at least in the literature, the way Euripides writes about it, 400 years before Jesus, there was this notion of sparagmos, like tearing the sacrificial victim apart limb from limb, and the omophagia, the consumption of the raw flesh. And so a word like trogon, it may seem like a tiny little wordplay or insignificant, but John's Greek is really inviting you to gnaw on the flesh of Jesus to become Jesus. And that's what Jesus says in the sixth chapter. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life. They remain in me and I remain in them. So it's not becoming God-like. It's you are what you eat. It is becoming God. The promise of Christianity in John's gospel is to consume God's flesh and blood to become God.
And so how does that sit with you that it is through a mind-altering substance that one experiences that? Like, does that something...
Well, it makes sense to me. Again, I'm not, not being a psychedelic experiencer. Mm-hmm. If you were to poll the Catholic world today and ask them if that's the effect they feel when they drink the wine or consume the bread, mm-hmm. not many folks will say that. I quote a poll in the book, something like 69% of American Catholics do not believe in transubstantiation, which is like one of the central doctrines of the church, that you are literally consuming the flesh and blood of God. Now, it's a thought experiment. We can't prove it, but if you were to poll the Greek-speaking world 2,000 years ago, 2,500 years ago, when they drank the blood of Dionysus, and the wine at the time was occasionally referred to as the blood of Dionysus. I quote Timotheus, an ancient author, who says, "Haima bachiu," the blood of Dionysus was considered to be present in that wine, and the sacramental drinking would send you into ecstasy, right, or frenzy, or madness. And again, we get into Greek technicalities, but the word for drunkenness that's often used in the ancient world, methe, doesn't necessarily mean inebriated by alcohol. It kind of means, and a better translation might be high, or like ecstatically charged, or again, frenzied, madness, mystical rapture. That's the effect that was described in the consumption of the blood of Dionysus. And so what happened from then until now? Like, is it possible that some sort of secret recipe or active ingredients went missing? It's a possibility. And I went into the actual organic data and some of the archaeobotany to try and show how complex the polypharmacy of ancient beer and wine actually was. It was very different from the wine of today.
Right. It's not a nice Merlot. Right. I mean, and thinking about that, sort of on that same train, you say that early followers of Jesus were not so different from the followers of Dionysus. And in turn, they're not so different than the spiritual but not religious groups of today. And I guess I'm wondering how they're all similar.
Right. So you alluded to it earlier, and I use this phrase in the book: are we Greek or are we Christian? And what I mean by that is, like, have we inherited all the rationalism and scientific process from those, hypercritical, skeptical Greeks, right? They give us the word skepticism, right? Which literally means to look about. These were skeptical people. And we have all these fairy tales, all these myths from antiquity, and we're led to believe that the ancient Greeks thought, Poseidon literally lived in the sea with his trident. And but that can't be the case. The Greeks, if anything, were after direct experience. And so when you look at a place like Eleusis, like we mentioned, or these Dionysian mysteries or these other mystery cults, I see it as a kind of scientific process that to me is commensurate with religious sensibility. And so are we Greek or are we Christian? Well, the Christian side of Western civilization would give rise, instead of skepticism, to things like belief and doctrine and dogma and more mediated experience, undirect encounters with the divine. And yet, is there a way to heal that? And are psychedelics, oddly, ironically, controversially, one of those technologies that actually bridges the world between the Greeks and the Christians, between our rational side and our spiritual sensibility? Like, I think religion and science were not as divided in the Greco-Roman world as they are today. And I think that these folks were, in a sense, scientists of the spirit. They would drink these potions and experiment with these sacraments and go through long initiation processes to really confront their mortality and try to answer all the questions we're trying to answer today about the meaning of life and life after death and our existence in this vast cosmos, instead of just relying on books or theory or abstract argument. Some of these folks went after hard answers in cups and potions.
One thing that I really love about this book, and a lot of students that I've worked with in this book really appreciate, is your focus on women, and the ways in which you articulate very clearly that, like, from Eleusis to the Dionysian cults to early Christianity to the witches of Europe, you seem to be making an argument for let's say a semi-broken line of women in touch with the earth, generating psychedelic brews. I guess I'm wondering, why do you think, like, beyond Demeter, like, why is it always women? Why was it always women who were in charge of these psychedelic concoctions until recent days?
That's something we can riff on for a while. And like, I didn't set out to write a feminist book, but like that's the data that kept coming back to me. And this is from conversations with specialists across all different disciplines, historians and prehistorians, and archaeochemists who really dig in to the botany and chemistry of what was happening, and to religious scholars and comparative mythologists, to folklorists. It was always women. Originally, Eleusis was a female rite of initiation, and it was only later that men were allowed to have this vision that was curated by Demeter and Persephone, these mother-daughter duo goddesses. And the men who would follow in their path were, the leading men of Plato, Marcus Aurelius centuries later. But originally, this was women. And there were female priestesses who remained involved in that tradition, like I said, for 2,000 years. In the Dionysian mysteries, the god's primary devotees were women who would enter into these ecstatic states, engage in that limb tearing and raw flesh eating and mixing the potions. I mean, you look at a Greek vase and you see women mixing potions. I went into the Louvre to look at their amazing collection, and you see women adding herbs and ingredients to these old wine jars. And that is a tradition that preceded the Greeks and Romans by hundreds and thousands of years, right? Women were traditionally perceived as the ones who would gather the raw ingredients and mix these potions. In the Sumerian period, it was women who would mix the beer. Same with the Egyptians. Well before that, going all the way back maybe to Göbekli Tepe and our very first beers, women were constantly involved. And then into the age of Christianity, women show up again. If you go into the catacombs under the streets of Rome, like I did, you'll see frescoes in which women are mixing up wine. Women are leading these proto-Eucharistic ceremonies, which were being celebrated for the ancestors. And something like, in a classical seance almost, they would enter into these catacombs, mix the wine, and that's how in the Roman period, folks would commune with the dead. And this is at least somewhat influenced the rise of Eucharistic celebration, at least in Rome and Italy. It was a well-known tradition called the refrigerium, which is where we get refrigerators. So you would go underground to chill out with the ancestors, and it wasn't men. As far as we know, it was women mixing these potions. And with the rise of the institutional church over the subsequent centuries, they begin to disappear, and they become the folk healers and medicine women, and like you mentioned, the witches of the Middle Ages and High Renaissance. And so it's a very strange phenomenon how it was always female expertise behind this pharmacology.
Yeah. Do you think what role do you think patriarchy, like just orthodox patriarchy, plays in this erasure of women in this context?
So that's the big conspiracy, right? So I mean, there was a great fear of women and drugs, and so even though women and drugs may have played a large part in the Greco-Roman mystery cults and early Christianity, for one reason or another, that they were perceived as a threat. And you don't want to overblow the hypothesis, but you can look at some of the writings of the early church fathers, Hippolytus amongst others, and they do talk about women mixing wine, even within the Christian tradition, which is really interesting. The followers of Marcus are portrayed by Hippolytus in his refutation against all heresies as mixing wine. And Hippolytus, interestingly, mentions the word pharmakon, the Greek word for drug, like seven times in sequence, to really rat out these devilish women mixing up these alternative Eucharists and an alternative mass, right? Which eventually gives way to the witches' Sabbath. You can draw that continuity from the Gnostic witches of the early centuries to the medieval witches. And so yeah, I mean, the patriarchy, listen, it was a huge part of the rise of the church. I mean, it's very easy to describe the evolution of the church. It went from one patriarchal male-led Roman institution into a male patriarchal institution of the church. That's where the popes and the cardinals and the bishops came from, and the priesthood itself. It was very much modeled on the Roman power structure. I mean, even the way the church was celebrated, it was this sort of monarchical, very, very male-heavy, bureaucratic institution. Look at the donation of Constantine into the transition from what was this Roman structure into the church. It's pretty self-explanatory.
So what less, I mean, I can talk to you about history all day long and it'd be tons of fun, and we got to do that at some point. But, we're in this modern context with this psychedelic revolution, which I will totally get into. Well, I guess I should say now. I have some issues with this notion of the psychedelic revolution or renaissance, in that, what's being seen a lot as a rebirth really seems like claiming indigenous culture, medicine practices as progressive and new and exciting, but at the same time sort of rejecting or not really paying attention to those very same communities that the medicines come out of. And I think one of the things I really like about this text is that it puts the mind-altering substances into a European context and a Western Christian context, almost to say like, hey, you don't have to go down to Peru to find your ayahuasquero, and you don't have to go to Gabon to find your ibogaine if you're a white American. And if you're a white Christian American, this is in your own cultural context.
Yeah.
So that's my little pushback with the psychedelic revolution, so to speak.
Yeah.
But I wonder what you think. I won't ask you what you think about the psychedelic revolution, but I wonder what you think about the role of seminaries in this new dawn age of psychedelics.
I think they're critical for lots of different reasons. And no, I do like your former point. I mean, I'm not trying to make political statements. I'm trying to make historical statements about the use of pharmacology, but it is important because there's a problem. I mean, the great irony of the 20th century is that it was largely white men from North America who would rediscover these power plants and power fungi, right? And so if that's the way in which these substances were rediscovered in the West, that's fine, but I do think we need to be careful about appropriating traditions that may not work, that either don't belong or may not work, or just, again, historically are inauthentic to where most people are at. And I say that to say that chaplaincy, whatever that means, whether that's Christian chaplaincy, Jewish, Muslim, some kind of secular interfaith chaplaincy, you name it. I think that there's a really strong argument to be made for that kind of spiritual expertise leaning in to whatever this renaissance is. And I've been saying recently that it's not to discredit the role of psychiatrists and psychologists and social workers. Like you need all of it. You need all the tent is big enough to accommodate all this expertise, but it has to include some kind of spiritual expertise. Now, whether that's through religious leaders, pastors, priests, rabbis, imams, counselors, ministers who've dedicated their lives to ushering people through these big transformations, right? Like life and death and marriage and everything in between. I just think there's great expertise there to help people navigate what could be one of the most powerful experiences of their lives. And again, this is what the clinical data shows, right? That like 75% of these clinical volunteers at Hopkins over the past 20 years wind up describing their single experience with psilocybin as the most meaningful or among the most meaningful in their entire life. Okay, now maybe, maybe you feel comfortable with a therapist, either administering that or in the wake of that experience. But for a lot of people, maybe you feel comfortable with other expertise. Maybe you do want to talk to your priest or your pastor. Maybe that's who your therapist is, or maybe you want to share it with your faith community. A lot of people find home in their congregations, and so I just think we need to be sensitive to that. I think there's all kinds of expertise that can weigh in.
Yeah, we're going to be fortunate enough to have Hunt Priest and Zach Commence later in this series. Two people who both participated in those Johns Hopkins studies who can talk directly about their experience, and both religious leaders. And Zach actually is from the GTU, so strong Bay Area ally. I was going to ask you one more question, but I think we've got a few questions in the Q&A that I want to try and hit, if that's okay. Anonymous attendee is asking, did your research include covens, I'm assuming, or other women's religious communities as possible containers of the important but secret knowledge you're seeking? I didn't see a mention of this in your book.
Oh, right, women religious in convents. I did do some research on that. It didn't make it into the book. And there's a whole other book to be written on monastic and contemplative communities that didn't quite make it in here. So I apologize for that. I was mainly focused on classical antiquity. but I do think there's a continuity. It's funny. I mean, both for men and women. There's in one chapter of the book, as we're talking about witches, I do mention that, you know, it was within monastic communities that some of these ancient texts were preserved, like Dioscorides. You know, Dioscorides was this ancient Greek pharmacologist, amongst other things, who writes in the 1st century this massive treatise, the Materia Medica, and it's written at the same time as the Gospels are being drafted, which is interesting. And that manuscript becomes one of the longest surviving manuscripts in the Western canon, which is fascinating. And it was because of scribes, largely in monasteries, who would retain those manuscripts and pass it along. So it's really intriguing to think about both men and women religious in Hermetic communities, preserving this knowledge, both, you know, from a written or abstract kind of way, and just maybe in a practical way. It wasn't just the witches. You know, there was this part of Italy that I focus on so much, Magna Graecia, that I think gave rise to the witches, also gave rise to the medical school in Salerno, which was the only medical school in Europe that accepted women. So, you know, I'm really curious to see what was happening around women and these power plants, including within convents. So I promise to do more work on that.
I guess that brings up a question, another good question. What, if anything, was left out of this text that you wish you'd been able to include?
Yeah. I was told I couldn't get away with a 600-page book my first time out. There was, I mean, there's a whole bunch. So, I mean, for starters, you know, I often say, it's true, I think I said it here, like, I artificially start the book at 12,000 years ago in the agricultural revolution. And, you know, this story is millions of years old, right? And so I think that would have helped place this, what I call the religion with no name, in even better context. Because, you know, imagine, well, here's an idea. What if, and this is a question that's not posed by me, but a paleoanthropologist in South Africa, Lee Berger, and I have been talking about this. What if the notion of self-mortality wasn't invented by Homo sapiens? You know, what if we inherited this idea from a predecessor species? In other words, like through pharmacology. What if we inherited not just pharmacology, but the things that come up with sacred pharmacology from a different species, like millions of years ago? And what if that was somehow passed down? I mean, it's obviously a wild idea, but, you know, you're probably familiar with the stoned ape theory and things like this. I mean, this is a really old story. It might be a galactic story. And then there's just like, there's so much in Jewish mysticism I wasn't able to get into. In Islamic mysticism, I wish I'd done more work on that too. Yeah, there's a lot missing.
Cool. Yeah, I'm ready for that next book whenever you want to write it. If you need some, let me know. Elizabeth B asks, beyond the mixing, is there a history of use of psychedelics that are across genders, or just men or women? Is there a history of using these both for spiritual transcendence and for recreation, or was this considered recreational?
That's a great question. I mean, it did include both genders. So even if women were, like, again, the primary brewers on the one hand and wine mixers on the other, like I said, the Eleusinian rites did wind up accepting men, and you would find male devotees of Dionysus too. And so, yeah, but that was always a political problem. In fact, in 186 BC, the Roman Senate famously cracked down on these Dionysian mysteries,
Right.
because they saw young men being initiated at the hands of women. In other words, like young military service age men basically falling to the prey of women in these mountains and forests of Italy was not a fun thing for the Roman Senate. So, like, there was always this power play between men and women. If you're looking for a place where that balances out, yeah, maybe it is in some of the early church communities. You see, there is reference to female-led communities in Paul's letters. He mentions several women who are leading churches, like female philanthropists, basically, who through their largesse are providing their homes. I mean, this is where the early church really takes shape. It's in homes. They were house churches. Like, but there were no brick and mortar churches for like a couple centuries. And so before that, it was in living and dining rooms, and it may have been women who were stocking these Eucharistic celebrations in a celebration that could have involved some kind of co-equal participation from men and women. We don't have a lot of data on that, but it'd be interesting to do some more work on the early congregations across the Mediterranean.
Yeah, and I also often wonder with what's going on today, if we might be better with some of those kitchen churches instead of some of the, major institutional sort of backing, psychedelic motivated projects going on right now, that maybe those smaller gatherings are more culturally responsive, maybe a little bit more, aware of their surroundings, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, that's you asked me before about how it impacted my faith. Like when the more you study what was really happening in those early churches and catacombs, right? Like the same catacombs where you see those frescoes and this bizarre refrigerium ceremony of the dead. Like what you find are relatively small gatherings of men and women coming together to contact the ancestors and the Lord of Death, right? I mean, Jesus, just like Dionysus and these other gods, were the lords of death. I mean, Jesus famously, the harrowing of hell incident between his crucifixion and resurrection. Jesus was seen as a mediator between these worlds. Let's not forget, he is the one who conquers death, but it invites us into that threshold, right? And that was always in relatively small numbers. There's not thousands of people getting together to celebrate this Eucharist. It was small groups. I wonder what that would look like today.
Yeah. Barbara Myers writes, I read your book and found it very interesting and challenging, and yet my ministry involves working with people with serious mental health crises. When I talk to them about their stories, it's not uncommon to learn that their symptoms came after taking a psychedelic substance, after which their lives spun out of control and they haven't been able to get back to their mental equilibrium even after years of treatment. Did your research or your experience lead you to anything similar happening in the ancient world? And do you have any caveats for the use of psychedelics today?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, yeah, listen, as a virgin, I'm the first to say that psychedelics are not for everybody. There are some anecdotes in antiquity about people going crazy, and there's also anecdotes about fatal wine, right? So, I mean, just from a pure pharmacological perspective, wine could be fatal, and we have to try and figure out what that meant, what was being added to wine to make it so so fortified and so toxic in some cases, right? Let's not forget about the hemlock potions that were used to kill people. So, like this stuff is dangerous just from a pure pharmacology perspective. And then the followers of Dionysus, yeah, again, it's, drunkenness is not the word to describe it. It's madness, right? And so there's something more than wine going on. And there is, yeah, the greatest cautionary tale is Euripides the Bacchae. There's a decapitation at the end. We definitely got to be careful. But the message there, it's interestingly, so the message from the Bacchae and these rites getting out of control, right? The famous Bacchanalia. The message there is that, well, number one, these drugs aren't for everybody. But number two, that the responsible thing to do would be to create containers, right? You often hear the term set and setting. So like the folks that you talk about, yeah, it's a tragedy and a shame, and something that I think is avoidable in the Renaissance of today. Like, number one, those with pre-existing conditions, or comorbidities, like aren't, we need to be very careful about who is getting access to psychedelics and under what terms, and maybe the regulation can address some of that. But I think that creating secret containers is a powerful thing. And again, maybe that happens in a secular setting, maybe it doesn't. But I think that it behooves us to think really clearly about the preparation that happens before one of these experiences, and not just a psychological preparation, but like a psych evaluation, maybe in some cases, depending on your family history, and some real thought that goes into integration and making sure all that expertise that we talked about is there, right? Not just psychiatric, but spiritual guidance too. Like this is not stuff to be toyed with.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I'd also advocate for some communal preparation as well. So often, I think this is sort of another divide between plant-based medicine and psychedelics. Seems like the end user for psychedelics is this one individual, whereas plant-based medicine kind of works more in community, right? Who's preparing it, who's sitting with you, who's working with you through it all. It doesn't, it doesn't end necessarily. It's you open up into a larger community of users and sitters and et cetera, et cetera. But I even think, some folks who, at least until very recently, were very highly praised in the psychedelic community, were big fans of high doses of medicines for folks. And, I think that's something inherited from the 60s, that 60s movement of like sort of blast off, which thankfully, today more folks are thinking about microdosing. Folks are taking what's called handshake doses, where they're just getting familiar with the medicine before going full on, full bore, I can't feel my toes anymore sort of thing. So I think there's lots of different evaluatory criteria that we're going to have to come up with culturally, individually, socially, before we can say that, this is safe for all people at all times. And I don't think it ever is going to be, actually.
No, not at all.
Yeah. James Clark asked, in reference to the Gnostic community's use of pharmacon, did you encounter information about the degree to which Gnostic concepts like the demiurge may have informed or affected their understanding of entheos, or even any community understanding of evil and or hell?
Oh, wow. That's I wish we had more time to wax on that. Yeah, the Gnostic texts are fascinating. I don't reference them as much as I would have liked to. I mean, I do talk about the Nag Hammadi corpus, obviously, that was discovered in Egypt in the last century. Talk a little bit about the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, which is very interesting. And yeah, in some of these, this demiurgic notion of pure Gnosticism kind of puts us into this fallen world, right? Mm-hmm. And it's somewhat reminiscent of the story in Genesis, but takes on a very different flavor with the Gnostics. And in some of these religious communities, it often manifested itself in, well, one of two things. Either, there was no harm that could be done to the flesh. In other words, just complete debauchery, because the flesh was to be punished and excoriated. Or in other words, that you see some of the austerities, like the denial of the flesh. Anything to do with the flesh is ultimately fleeting and transitory. And so maybe that gives rise to different contemplative traditions and sort of this negative theology. But the question of evil is a bigger one. I wish that we had more time to answer here in terms of the entheos and the use of these sacraments. But you raise a good point. I mean, when you're talking about that word that was coined by Carl Ruck, whose research I certainly follow. Carl Ruck wrote this book that really sparked my research, called The Road to Eleusis. And this notion of being filled with the spirit of the divine, this entheos concept, is there's a world in which you have to ask what God you're being filled with, right? And this case of spirit and demonic possession, and that's something else to be kept in mind today, by the way. For those who don't believe in spirit or demonic possession, the being possessed by the spirit was sort of the calling card of Dionysus, right? And this is partially why women were attracted to that cult, by the way. Getting back to the earlier point, I'm getting off topic here, but women, it is thought, were called to the cult of Dionysus because in a society that was not friendly to women in the Greek world, it was their chance at finding spiritual exaltation and liberation through this demonic possession, right? And this is something you can see in some of the religious cults in the Caribbean as well. Some great anthropological research there. So I don't think that answers the question, but at least there's some word salad.
Beautiful word salad. Chris writes, Brian, I very much appreciate the extensive research that went into your work. I'm curious as to what you consider to be the gaps in your historical case. I must admit that I found the second half of the book to make a weaker argument And the claim that the original Eucharist was psychedelic is so far unevidenced, especially when we have good evidence for other methods of inducing alternate states of consciousness, such as sensory deprivation, chanting, etc. I'm reading that because I know you've had this comment before, and I really liked your response, but I want to hear what you're going to say now.
This has come up, I mean, as you can imagine, quite a bit.
Right.
You know, it's when I say the original Eucharist, and I try and be clear about this through the text, it is not the Eucharist of the Last Supper that interests me. What interests me are those proxy Eucharists that were used by some Greek-speaking communities at some point in history, in this Hellenistic universe, for whom the notion of spiked wine was commonplace, which is not to say there wasn't table wine or ordinary wine that was served at the symposium. But you know, when you're in a world in which there's this Dionysian potion, right, giving rise to these maddened, ecstatic, frenzied states, you have to ask that for some communities of Greek-speaking Christians, whether or not the way that John's gospel is languaged and the audience that was being addressed by that would have tried to merge these Christian and Dionysian worlds. And the easiest way to do that is through some of these potions. It's not to the exclusion of other techniques of ecstasy. I talk about incubation in the book, of course, and you know, lying down in cave-like settings, amongst other things. But you know, there's a lot of weird stories in the New Testament, from Paul being struck blind on the road to Damascus. Peter is described in Acts as caught up in trance. They were speaking in tongues. So like we do know that there are altered states of consciousness, visionary states even, happening in early Christianity. So whether or not that's psychedelically induced, is there hard organic data to prove that? No. And that's kind of how I finished the book, with this big open question. And part of it has to do with the state of archaeochemical research and the vessels that have been tested. You know, I think it's a hypothesis that's worth investigating, just based on what was happening in the Greco-Roman world before that. But you know, I'm the first to say that I don't believe the Last Supper itself was a psychedelic affair. What I think is worth asking is how was that event interpreted by the earliest Greek-speaking communities, and did they want that to be some kind of, you know, mind-altering affair? That's the question that interests me, and I try and hyper focus, particularly on Italy, for that reason, where you saw this great diffusion of the mystery cults, and for me, it's easy to imagine those Greek mystery cults giving rise to a syncretic, you know, Greek Christian flair that you do see evidenced in those catacombs for centuries.
Yeah, it's interesting how it seems as though some forms of Catholicism again and again try and rule out the ecstatic. And yet whenever it's exported to any other place, Haiti, Jamaica, the Caribbean, Latin America, the ecstatic forms come back in, right? The possession comes back in, the music comes back in, right? It's almost as though like Christianity's like, Catholicism's missing component is the ecstatic, and cultural references locally sort of fill in that gap, even from 2,000 years ago.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and it's not, again, the psychedelic question is one thing, but where I'd hope that we could agree is, I mean, Elaine Pagels is the first to say that, I mean, there is no Christianity without visionary states, right? If you get rid of the letters of Paul, there's no evangelization across the Mediterranean. And so, you know, Paul never met Jesus in the flesh. Let's remember, and that he communicated through some sort of auditory hallucination with his dead and risen Savior. So, you know, there is this notion of ecstasy in these early communities, and I think the question is, what were those archaic techniques, you know, that we've lost, and what does that mean for the rise of this faith, in this whole Greek versus Christian analysis? There is room for the irrational, and I'm fascinated in trying to figure out what gave rise to that irrationality.
Reverend Ron Ferris asks, was there a narrative theological through line running through the ancient Greek, Roman, Christian entheogenic use? Eat the God to be the God, sure, but what is the God at that point?
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think of a through line. I mentioned the Lord of Death,
Right.
from Dionysus to Jesus. If there's a through line at all, it's not just God as the Lord of Death, but you would want to say a conception of God, the indwelling divinity, maybe is the way to put it. So there was certainly from Eleusis and the rites that preceded, there's this concept of discovering the true self. And so, going through this initiatory process to be convinced, beyond reasonable doubt that some part of you survives the physical body. And this also happens with the possession states, to show that the body as a sort of shell, right? It's a famous Platonic line that we're like oysters trapped in a shell. So if there's one through line, it's that maybe the body is a vessel. This is an illusory existence that we navigate, and these compounds can put us in touch not with the God out there or the God beyond, but the God within us. That's certainly a very Gnostic reading of Jesus, which I think would have made sense again to those initiates of the mystery cults, but there's a different flavor, obviously, across the centuries.
Yeah. Sort of connected to that question, Heather Reba writes, I enjoyed your book very much. My question is regarding the concept of dying before you die, so that when you die, you don't actually die. Do you think there was a historical sense of salvation the way that we think of it today? What happened to folks who didn't experience death or the mysteries prior to death? Was the belief that they weren't immortal, or was that the purpose of the mysteries only to dispel the fear of death?
Oh, I mean, in the Greek world, it's quite clear. Like you went to Hades, to a miserable existence. This is at least in the Greek conception of death. If you look at Homer, what happens to those poor people who die in Homer, who haven't been initiated? There's I'll paraphrase a famous line like, "I'd rather be a servant than king of all the dead." I mean, there's this idea that like the afterlife is not a happy place for those who hadn't been initiated. And we have a lot of testimony from Eleusis that only those who went through that experience would never die. And so, and it was only those who went to Eleusis who became immortal. If you hadn't experienced that death before death, the afterlife was not an inviting, friendly place for people. And so all we can imagine is something like, some kind of eternal damnation. But it wasn't a fun place.
All the more reason to you. No, I'm checking. So someone writes, sorry, I just got this through messages, so forgive me for not naming you. How on earth can we define Greek Middle Eastern practices into a white Christianity which drives capitalism, inequality, and racism? This is just as foreign as the curandero, ayahuasqueros, etc. I don't follow. I enjoyed tremendously your book and historical and research framework, but I can't see how this can be integrated into a new Christian framework. Note, I am from a Jewish background. Can you please clarify? Does that?
Yeah. I'd like to be able to answer. I mean, listen. The Christianity has certainly evolved, and I don't know. I don't know what the answer is to reincorporating archaic Christianity, what I call Paleo Christianity, into white evangelical Christianity of today. Maybe it doesn't fit. I think what I try to do is at least shine a spotlight on what was happening in the early church, which is very different from the churches of today. And the through line for me was language. So I wouldn't invite people just to learn ancient Greek for no reason. But you mentioned your Jewish background. Like most of my Jewish friends learned some Hebrew at some point. Most of my Muslim friends will learn at least some Quranic Arabic. And amongst Christians, unless you're Orthodox, I think it's very uncommon to learn ancient Greek as your sacred language. And so it might seem like Pollyannish, but I do think some knowledge of the ancient Greek and the ancient Greek world is at least the beginnings of some kind of restoration of what may have been happening in the early church, again, which is why I focus on the wine and those sacraments, and like, how would people in the first century have understood the Jesus story? The language really matters. The Greek really matters, and the culture and habits of the time really matter. And I don't think it's possible to export that to the 21st century, but at least it provides some context. So, I mean, yeah, I hear you.
And just question, this is my question. In that work, did you ever look at the Eastern Orthodox churches and see how their translations might have impacted their understanding of the Eucharist?
Yeah, but not enough as I should have. And I think you mentioned like something else that was missing from the book. I mean, I would have loved to have written a whole book or a series of books about the other early Christianities, right? I mean, like the oldest, and you and I have actually talked about this, like the oldest church, the oldest communities are in what today are countries that you might not associate with the most popular Christianities. I mean, places like Algeria and Turkey was certainly one of the strongest. I think the one of the oldest churches is the Ethiopian church, obviously. Armenia, I think, was the first country to follow Christianity nationwide. So, like, there's a whole different Christianity out there than made it through to what became Christianity of the West. And so, yeah, there's a whole fascinating analysis to be done on Eastern liturgy and what may have been retained again from that time. Like, how did the Ethiopian church interpret the story of Jesus? I think that's a fascinating research proposal.
Right. What about the Coptic church, right? Like all of these different angles. Because we're talking about language, Jennifer writes, how do we give Catholic priests the language that can create comfort around the term mystical experience, as mystical is a loaded word? I think it's a great question, given that, mystical but not religious group that is getting larger and larger in the US.
Yeah, I mean, there's some leaders who are comfortable with that. I mean, the contemplatives are certainly comfortable with that. If you talk to at least some Franciscans, or some Jesuits or Dominicans or Benedictines, and some Trappists, I mean, you'll find currency in the word mystical. Yeah, but that never made it into the lexicon of the larger church. There's always this tension between the bureaucracy and the mystics. I think I write about that in the intro or the first chapter, and that's a phenomenon you find in most organized and traditional faiths. And so maybe it's up to the periphery, which you could call the mystical core, to keep that alive. But again, this sense of the felt presence of God in these direct encounters, maybe that's where the seminary, maybe this is fertile conversation for the seminary, as we were talking about earlier. Those who are lovers of the text and lovers of history and tradition. I think that there's a place for this conversation maybe to be happening there, and in the divinity schools and in fora like this that can actually help enrich the liturgy and enrich the way most religious leaders understand these experiences.
I want to read a question that I'm pretty sure you don't have the answer to, but I just think it'd be good for the audience to hear. It was, do you have any surveys or any other way to determine how many priests and ministers have used LSD or psychedelics? I'm a retired UU minister, and maintaining an interest in religion came entirely from the use of peyote and pure acid in the 60s. I would never anyone, but at a gathering at a seminar some years ago, about 12 of us who fell into this category had a sort of secret meeting. It was very illuminating. At least 2 participants in this group are now deceased, but I would love to know about others, and especially younger ministers, as I hear microdosing is hot these days. I suppose you have any surveys, do you?
I don't have any leads. I mean, I get the question perfectly. I think that is definitely something to be asked of Hunt Priest,
Yes.
who will be later on in the series. I understand that he is if any polls have gone around, but there's certainly an interest in finding out, how deep these experiences are in religious leaders across denominations. I'd be fascinated to see the results myself.
Yeah, Hunt Priest and, like I said, Zach Commence Hunt Priest is an Episcopal minister. Zach Commence is a rabbi. They're going to be speaking to us in 2 sessions about their mystical experience. Hunt has gone on to start an organization that helps religious leaders and lay people talk about psychedelic experiences. So really, really great guy. Excited to have him coming. Will Hagen asked if there are any thoughts on Terence McKenna's theory about a prehistoric culture of ritual psychedelic use and goddess worship.
Yeah, that's one of my favorites in Food of the Gods.
Mhm.
He does a pretty good there. For those who don't know, there was this hypothesis about this, egalitarian, agricultural, goddess worshiping, female-led community of largely mushroom consuming people who were then replaced by the patriarchal, warlike, largely male-led, alcoholic drinking cultures, and it was always. But actually, that was part of the idea that for me gave rise to this search of hallucinogens within beer and wine. It's something that Terence actually mentions very briefly in the Food of the Gods, and so I think it wasn't necessarily that the culture, what like Jimbuta was the old Europe, this culture, this goddess worshiping old Europe. I don't think it was necessarily replaced. I just think it found other containers, like we were talking about earlier, like through Eleusis. Again, you see the old culture, the female, the female culture being retained in rites like that. And there you do see potentially the use of alcohol, not supplanting the psychedelics, but working in concert. I don't know if they were working in concert with mushrooms, if any mushrooms, or what the secret sauce was, but I became fascinated, thanks to Terence, in the concept of some of that old culture, old Europe, being retained in the mystery cults and never fully disappearing, actually.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I always have to remind people is that in the ancient world, beer and wine were probably safer to drink than water, right? Like contaminant fungi, like bioorganisms could live in water very easily that could kill you, whereas the low alcohol content in beer oftentimes killed some of those microbes. So, you never know. On top of that, we're also so focused in our current psychedelic revolution on, mushrooms or fungi, right? There are a host of plants that have mind-altering properties, right? Some individually, some in combination. I always think that in the ancient world, because they were closer to the land and because they needed it to survive, were generally better like casual chemists and like biologists than we are today.
Yeah.
So I think there's some knowledge in there that we've begun to we've lost, but hopefully we can.
And they wrote about that too. In addition to, I mean, Dioscorides doesn't mention that much, but I mentioned that psychologist who wrote that treatise in the 1st century. In one of his books, there's like 56 different recipes for spiking wine with various plants and herbs and spices and toxins. And so, there was a whole pharmacopoeia that we've really lost,
Yeah.
and a great deal of expertise that was in the ancient world. I mean, a real understanding of botany of the air and how to manipulate that for all kinds of different purposes.
Mm-hmm. Simone says, I've seen the catacombs in Rome and I found them very cool. What are some of your thoughts on the place?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned them just briefly for some of them, this refrigerium scene in which women are seen consecrating wine, and this is in Catholic in Catholic catacombs. You see this all over the place. One of my favorites was, I won't get into detail, but the hypogeum of the Aurelii was particularly fascinating, not least of which because Circe makes an appearance in the catacombs there. And it was only relatively recently opened. It went through a long restoration process. And I was fortunate to visit this hypodium where you see Circe, basically the grand high witch of antiquity, painted onto the wall, not far from what looks like a Eucharistic banquet. Around 12 men are seated celebrating something that looks like a Last Supper, not the Last Supper, but something like it. And so that it just goes back to the point of the syncretism between the ancient Greek world and the burgeoning Christian world, and what that all meant at the time, and the fact that it all seems bound up in this pharmacology. I wish I could show the hypodium, but on one wall you see something like a Eucharistic celebration, and on the there's Circe, depicted at the exact moment when she is transforming the companions of Odysseus into pigs. And for anyone who knows that scene in Homer, it's through the use of pharmacology and drugs. There is no Circe without her knowledge of drugs, and it's a very weird juxtaposition, as the catacombs are in general. So I mean, I know that's circumstantial evidence, and that's all it is. But when the interest on my part is combining all that with some of this organic data to try and get a clearer picture of what was happening in Paleo Christianity.
Someone's asking, how has your book been received by mainstream Catholic communities, and especially conservative Catholic communities? And my favorite question, has the Vatican issued a response?
No official response that I know of. And anecdotally, all I can say is it's been really well received. I've have lots of positive feedback for across Christian nations, and not a lot of hate mail. So I don't know attribute that to, but so far so good.
Yeah, I'm actually a little surprised, I will say. A few more questions. We're getting close on time, and I think your connection's a little weak. But Alida asks, would mysticism be threatening to religious leaders who expect to control people? Mysticism seems to lead to more individual experience, which is more difficult for others to control. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, the end is an obvious one. I think it is a threat. Watson, there's nothing the church fears more than the setting up of a democracy, the kingdom of heaven. You know, the kingdom belongs to the kings and queens. What happens if there's a popular outbreak of mysticism? I think, and I think there's always this tension between and that thirst for direct experience that has always lived in these contemplative communities, right? From the beginning of the church, there was the orders, monasteries, and these convents that a radical life that wasn't always, responsive to Rome, but responsive to a different authority. And so there's always this tension. But I wonder today, like if there's a place for widespread mysticism, or what would happen or outbreak. I don't know on the transformation.
Yeah, I don't know. You know, the mystic always seems to have to contend with the organization, right? That anybody can walk out there and call themselves a mystic, but if they want to get support, they need to be able to have some sort of foundation around them, and whether that be individuals or institutions. And I think when you have individuals supporting you, it becomes a cult, and when you have institutions supporting you, I don't know. I just think it's harder. I think it's harder to, sometimes when I'm talking in class, I'm like, there was a time when the preacher, the minister, the imam was not responsible to tell people only what they wanted to hear. Like it wasn't always about, gospel, good news. Sometimes it was hard news. Sometimes it was, hey, here are the things that you have to do that are uncomfortable. And I think it's harder and harder these days to tell congregations things that they don't want to hear. risk of job, risk
That's
of,
interesting.
so it's an ongoing process, I'll say. It's an ongoing, evolving process in theological circles. How do we maintain the mystical while at the same time cultivating healthy relationship with the communities that we're working with?
Hmm.
Your connection's cutting out. We're almost out of time. I guess I got one more question for you, and it sounds like
Okay.
a little provocative, but I don't mean to be. Um, but and personally, I'm not that interested, but I just think it's an interesting question. What would it take for you to experience have a psychedelic experience? Like what would the proper context be for you?
You would have to invite me to the Bay Area. And let's get going.
I suspect it might take a little more than that. But you're always welcome.
It's something I think about. Something I think about all the time. I mean, I don't know. I'm trying when I often think about like what would it take for the average person for whom this thing, this topic is controversial, right? And there was that comment earlier. I'm still thinking about it, about the negative effects that can happen in the wake of a psychedelic experience, and maybe this isn't for everybody. All that to say, I am curious, and I am thinking about like what that container looks like, and it's the kind of container I would want to heal those Christian worlds, right? So like equal parts rational, skeptical, scientific, where you're maximizing safety, with all the expertise and technology we have today, but also deeply mystical, deeply sacred, that taps into the best of the contemplative traditions, and I think like the very best of the Christian message around love and community. I don't know if that's a solo journey or if it's a small group journey. Again, like we were talking about, these small communities, these agape communities that we're forming. I don't know. I don't know what it looks like. I'm trying to figure it out. Plus, it's illegal. And so it's, if you think about what that would look like, and equal access to people who need it, especially in communities that have been unduly burdened by the war on drugs. I mean, that's a big deal. We need to talk about legality and access for everybody, like not just me. I think there's a lot to be thought through here.
I expected as much. Beautiful, thorough answer. I want to thank you so much for starting out this amazing series that we're going to have on psychedelics in the seminary. You are the perfect launch as far as I'm concerned. March 1st, for those of you that are still on, we're going to be having Mariana Eddowes come and speak to us. Since 2009, she's traveled to the US to offer healing ceremonies and rituals, and she has a growing spiritual community. She works out of Peru, and she's performed shamanic ceremonies with Wachuma and run sweat lodges, as well as sound healings, offerings to the Mother Earth, flower baths, and rituals for spiritual healing for humanity and the planet. She's also worked from 2005 to 2016. She organized 7 versions of an international coca leaf forum in Peru, Argentina, Bolivia, Ecuador, and Colombia to promote the good use of the sacred coca leaf as part of ancestral Andean traditions for rituals and medicine, as well as a nutritional supplement. I wish you two could actually get together. I think it would be an absolutely great conversation. I hope everybody who came had a good time, learned something, grew. Please come to that next one. Please follow Brian wherever he may go. He's got some really great stuff online. I have an interview with him with the LA Review of Books, which I think is even add some more dimension to this conversation. Please check it out. Just thank you so much. Rosemary, am I handing it back over to you?
Add my thanks.
Yeah,
I'd love to add my thanks to yours. Brian, I was gonna like introduce you, listen a few minutes, and then run off and do work that I had to do. And now I didn't get any work done because I couldn't leave. This was really fabulous and such a great introduction for those of us who have been curious but don't really know a lot. That whole part about early Christianity was just fascinating to me. And I can't thank you enough for launching our series. And Ayize, your questions were provocative and wonderful. And thank you to all of the folks who came. Your questions were wonderful. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them, but clearly we've provoked a lot of thinking. We look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks for the next lecture series. And Brian, you have an open invitation to come to Starr King whenever you want.
Oh, I'd be honored. You're so nice. It's been a real honor to be with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.